Let's get into some football at 4 with Johnny Mack and get his take on it. Everybody, of course, waiting for the football at 4 each and every day here on the Sports Bash on 97.3 ESPN. What's going on, John?
Not much. I wish it would stop raining for 10 seconds.
That's true.
That evidently is never going to happen.
No, we just talked to Scott Lauber, who's down in Clearwater, and it's very nice there. Not so nice here, but there's a lot going on. Let's dive into some of the football topics that are on our mind today. And a couple of them include the Eagles, and I want to get your take on this, the thought that the Eagles are going to be in play for wide receivers during free agency. Demarcus Robinson's name keeps kind of getting reported out there. It seems like a lot. Is he going to be like that hot name of the guy who didn't do a whole heck of a lot, but because he played for the Chiefs, you're going to hear him attached to teams that need wideouts?
Yeah, that's part of it. You know how it works. You're coming off there's a couple things. You're coming off your first contract. You haven't produced to a high level, and in theory, you're going to be a bit of a bargain, whereas guys who are produced at the highest level, if they actually get to free agency, Amari Cooper would be the most notable example at wide receiver there. That means you're going to have to overpay. That's just what free agency is. Doesn't matter the position, you're going to have to overpay. And that's sort of part of it. So it tends to be the best free agent pickups are those younger guys who maybe haven't broken out for whatever reason. And obviously Kansas City is tremendously deep at wide receiver. So you understand why he hasn't got a ton of playing time. So a lot of it is sort of like a mini draft evaluation. And you say, well, this guy's behind Tyreek Hill. He's behind Sammy Watkins. He didn't have an opportunity, but we think he could become a really good player. And if you hit a home run in that circumstance, you look really, really bright. So it's not only the Eagles. You're going to hear that name with any team that needs help at wide receiver.
So you look at the wide receiver list. We kind of went over some of them when Jeff was here. They did their Inside the Birds podcast. You mentioned Cooper, Emmanuel Sanders, Robbie Anderson, A.J. Green. Is there any priority player on that list of free agents that you would say that would be a good fit if the Eagles got him? But otherwise, if it's not him, that free agency doesn't make sense. And not that means they wouldn't draft somebody still, but is there one guy in this free agent class that you would say, yes, that should be a priority if you can get him, all other guys not interested in?
Well, I think there's a couple levels to it. And first, you have to make the decision on your own guys. And how are you going to move forward about the guys already inside the NovaCare complex? Most notably Alshon Jeffrey. I think a lot of people are assuming the Eagles are just going to take their medicine and swallow and move on because the narrative that he's Alshonimous and he's the guy and he's the chemistry. They even put it on Eagles.com. They never put anything negative on Eagles.com. And you got Dave Spadaro taking a sort of a backhanded shot at Alshon Jeffrey. So that kind of tells you what people, at least, who aren't involved with Howie Roseman, Andy Weidel, and the daily meetings, everybody's pointing at this guy and saying, you got to move on, you got to move on, you got to move on. Well, it's not that easy. The salary cap hit is astronomical. And then the fact, even if you want to trade him, he's injured. He's not going to be ready for September. He's not going to be ready probably for half the season. So in many ways, you might have to swallow the medicine in a different way and keep him around and let him rehab because that's better for your salary cap situation anyway, and maybe keep him away from the team that way. But if you do that, that affects your assets you can use at the position. So that's a very long-winded way of saying you got to make decisions in-house first. And, oh, by the way, I haven't even gotten to Nelson Aguilar, who, if you don't want to bring Nelson Aguilar back, and I don't want to bring him back, I'm not trying to say the Eagles, I don't think they should bring him back. I think from his perspective and the team's perspective, a new start would be good for each. and I think it would help Nelson as well as the Eagles, but that means you need multiple bodies at that position. So they have to make these difficult decisions before they say, can we go out and get receivers on the free agent level? I'm certainly going to draft one or two, I would imagine, and try to roll bodies in here. But I do think what I can say, it's not going to be Amari Cooper. It's not going to be A.J. Green. It's not going to be that high level. It's going to be that secondary level. And you brought up the most notable name there, and Robinson. They've had interest in Robbie Anderson on the trade market. Perhaps that kind of receiver as well.
So how does the questions on the other side of the ball, John, impact who's brought in here, whether that's through the draft or free agency? Malcolm Jenkins and his contract is lingering over the Philadelphia Eagles right now, and, Rodney McLeod, and they could have two new safeties. They might have to decide on one of them, and then the domino effect into the offensive side of the ball with those decisions.
Yeah, no question. I say this all the time, and people hate to hear it because they love mock drafts, but mock drafts are meaningless until you get through that first phase of free agency, because your draft board changes once you sort of go into free agency. It's a two-pronged thing. You obviously earmark players you would like. Sometimes you get them, sometimes you don't. If you don't get them, maybe you do have a safety in mind, and that's going to be one of your guys. Well, if you're not able to get them, and you don't like a lesser name in free agency, you're going to have to address it in the draft. So free agency has such a massive impact on the draft, and you'll see all these mock drafts right now. They'll look at the offseason rosters of every team, not just the Eagles, and they'll say, well, they need a cornerback, they need a wide receiver. Somebody might need a defensive lineman. Somebody might need a left tackle. Well, then all of a sudden the first 2 days of free agency come and you get the first left tackle off the board. Well, you're not going to draft a left tackle. So it shakes up everything. And that's the whole point. So that's why talent gathering season, Howie season, as they call it in Philadelphia, that's why it's exciting. And it's two-pronged. It's not just the draft. It's not just free agency. And then you have the second level, which I always point back to the Super Bowl season. That's where the Eagles won the Super Bowl. That's where they got Patrick Robinson and LeGarrette Blount and Chris Long. After that first phase of free agency, in that second phase, and that's what they haven't done as well in the two ensuing seasons.
Yeah, that's where, and you talk about wide receivers, there's that second list of guys, like the second tier. Maybe they go and try to pluck a couple of those guys and go through the draft, and you don't see that higher profile guy. Would you like Perryman? He was a first-round pick. He was hurt, had the drops. He was given a shot last year in Tampa, and, man, he was pretty darn good. Is that a product of that offense and the volume that they just targeted him a lot, or is he a guy that would be able to be had on a good value?
Well, I think you could get a decent value, but I think there's a lot of guys like that. And boy, there was so much bad before there was any good. I would be very hesitant. You look at guys like Josh Doxson and Laquan Treadwell, all those old first-round receivers who just didn't live up to the billing. Perryman was in that category and had a bit of a breakout, as you mentioned. But there was a lot of bad before that good. So I don't see the consistency there, and I don't think he'd be a big-ticket item. But I would be very concerned if the Eagles went in that direction. I wouldn't advocate it, I'd say that.
All right, Johnny Mac's in the house, football at 4. Let's get into some more NFL stuff as well. Browns plan, they're going to try to follow the Eagles front office. This isn't a surprise. They're going to go with a VP of football operations and a VP of player personnel under GM Andrew Berry. Now, we talked a lot about the Eagles' setup here. Cleveland's going to follow it because of Berry, but this just should be an interesting. The idea is to have one executive head up scouting, one head up everything else, and both report to the GM. Former Eagle executive Ryan Grigson's going to be a part of this. It's a system that I guess some think work well in Philly. Is this a model that we're going to start seeing more around the league?
It's kind of hard to say. I mean, if you look at the Eagles model, and as I said, it's funny, and I say this with the coaching staff. A lot of times I think the Eagles want to create murkiness, so you don't know where to look. If you want to blame somebody for something, and you talk about accountability, there's so many layers, it's tough to say. We've talked about a lot with the offensive coordinator. It's tough to point at somebody and say, this guy's responsible for this. And the Eagles have created even more layers with, if you think about the coaching staff now and the change from offensive coordinator to senior offensive assistant. You got the vice president of player personnel is now also an assistant coach on defense. So it seems to me they're trying to create murkiness. So I think if Andrew Berry learned anything from the Eagles, I think it's to create murkiness. I don't think it's necessarily looking at the flow chart and saying we have to copy this.
I guess the news out of that really is that the Eagles have these two guys. One's ahead of scouting, the other's ahead on the football side, and they report to Howie. Who are those two guys?
Well, the Eagles actually have three.
Okay, who are those
guys? The Eagles have three. They have Jake Rosenberg, who in essence is salary cap administrator, helps with contracts. You have Alec Hallaby, who's analytics, data analysis, data science, whatever you want to call it. I hate that term, analytics. And then they have Andy Waddle, who's personnel. So the Eagles actually have three. And, oh, by the way, when Andrew was here, he was ahead of those three. So they had another layer between Howie Roseman and those three. Now that Andrew's gone, those three sort of report to Howie, who's involved in each department. So that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. There's a lot of murkiness, even though you explained it.
And it's sort of funny. And, it clicked for me. Actually, I started to think about it when I started to think about all these coaching moves. And the one I've mentioned is Jeremiah Washburn, who essentially took over Andy Waddle's old job as the first lieutenant to Joe Douglas. So Jeremiah Washburn, who was also the assistant defensive line coach in essence, is now Andy Waddle's top lieutenant in personnel. It's a very, very strange system. So I guess if I round about to your original question, no, I don't think people are going to try to copy this.
All right, Johnny Mac here, John McMullen at JF McMullen on Twitter. He's on the Boardwalk on the Hotline, Football at 4. A weird report out of Detroit, okay? So, and you'll probably pontificate more on where this came from, and I think the more interesting story might be how these things come about. But a TV station in Detroit reported that the Lions are engaged in trade talks regarding Matthew Stafford. And the Lions have come out and said this is completely untrue. But this is the time of the year, and I think the listeners might be interested to know about where these things come from and whether or not you think that the Lions would be up for trading Matthew Stafford. Is this, the agent wants to get his client some attention or signed by a certain team? I mean, what are you reading here?
Well, essentially, when you see things like this and they're credible, it is coming from the agent. Now, a lot of times, because of the new media landscape, you just have people throwing things against the wall. And you mentioned, for instance, we talked about free agency, and people will just look at the team and look at the needs and look at the list and say, so-and-so is interested in so-and-so, which is not the most credible thing to do, but I'd be lying to you if I said people didn't do that, because they often do it. But, yeah, I mean, generally these things, when you see it from proven reporters, it's coming from the agent. In this instance, I mean, that would be such a salary cap hit. I don't see how the Lions could do it. So from their perspective, hey, maybe if, Cincinnati, for instance, wanted to trade the number one overall pick. And for whatever reason, Joe Burrow doesn't want to play there because of the reputation of the Cincinnati Bengals and how they do business. And we all know people have already started to speculate about that and him pulling in Eli Manning in essence. Well, then maybe you have a trade partner. But again, the cap ramifications don't make any sense from the other team's perspective. But would Detroit like to get younger and get maybe the number one overall pick? Well, sure, of course they would. But I always talk about quarterbacks. You know, you can talk about moving on from a quarterback who's good and not great, like a Matthew Stafford, but you got to look at the back end. Well, how are you going to get better? And you can talk about getting Joe Burrow. You can talk about getting the number one overall pick, but that's pie in the sky. It's not going to happen. So if you're using 100% scale, what are the odds that the Detroit Lions trade Matthew Stafford? Probably 5%. Is that worthy of a story in the Detroit News? Well, if you want clicks, it's worthy of a story.
Yeah, WDIV got their name out there for at least a couple hours today. Another quarterback potentially on the move. This one makes a little bit more sense. Andy Dalton, 1 year left on his contract. He has no guaranteed money. The Cincinnati would save $17.7 million by just cutting ties with Andy Dalton, but they're going to help him possibly trade. And do you think there would be a market for Andy Dalton? He seems like one of those guys that if you asked 9 out of 10 fans, they'd say he stinks. But would he have value on the trade market?
No, I think he would have value, and I think he's going to have value, and I think he's going to be a starting quarterback in this league. But everybody in this league knows also what you just said, and they understand, well, they can talk about trading him, and maybe we'll give you a conditional 7th-round pick if we don't want to deal with negotiating and other teams trying to get in the mix. Nothing of value because they understand they have to cut him. They're moving on. They're not going to bring him back. So all of that enters into that equation and how things go about it. Similar, you saw what the Eagles did with Nick Foles and all that bluster about, no, we want him back. We're going to keep him. We're going to try to trade him. Well, you can say that all you want. Everybody knows you kicked the can as far as you could. I talked about it a lot last season. You did it as far as you could, and everybody knew you had to cut him. You can't carry two quarterbacks who are set to make over $20 million once Carson Wentz got his extension. Because you remember the Eagles did that lip service with the contract games and went as far as they could. But once you go as far as you could, you got to stop.
I saw something interesting here. I mean, while we're on the topic of ridiculous potential trades, I'll throw one out at you. And it actually, was a little bit interesting here. So here we go. The Chargers would trade the number 6 pick to Carolina for Cam Newton.
Yeah, I like that one, actually.
All right.
I've also heard there was an even more insane one about them trading Christian McCaffrey as well to try to get. That was another Joe Burrow one. So everybody's already on that bandwagon. But right. I do think I've talked about it a lot with Carolina. I mean, they're in rebuild mode, and they signed Matt Rule to a 100-year contract. In actuality, 7 years, but that's a lot for a first-time coach, and that's an indicator that they're going to give him time to do exactly what he wants to do, and that means he's going to rip it down and start all over. So I don't know if they need Cam Newton, and Cam Newton at this stage of his career probably doesn't need a rebuilding situation, so it makes sense from him as well. And we talked about the Chargers with Tom Brady and those rumors. About selling tickets, and Cam's not Tom Brady, but he would be impactful from that aspect as well.
All right, last one for John as we look at some of the offseason stuff. Man, it's been busy as we get ready. By the way, when is the start of free agency? Is it March 18th?
Yeah, March 18th is the new league year, so that's the day everybody's got to get under the salary cap the top 51 rule. Everybody's got to be in line. So you're going to have a lot of movement before then as far as big-ticket players getting cut, getting released. So certain teams get their financial house in order. So there's going to be more names available than you see on these lists because there are a bunch of teams that have to make very difficult decisions.
All right, last one. Nick Caesarea will remain the Patriots' director of player personnel. Most people don't know who that is, but if you're the Patriots' director of player personnel, probably people want to know more about him. Who is he, and why don't people know this guy?
Well, I think people in the league certainly know him. There's a lot of speculation that New England was holding on to him and he wanted to leave, which just kind of lowers that a little bit. And he's the top personnel guy for Bill Belichick, and he has been. And
he doesn't get the praise, though, that, the guy who's in charge of player personnel there, it's like his name with the fans isn't readily as known as some of these other guys who it is deemed that they are the reason.
Yeah, and they have the GM title, and Bill has the GM title. But as I always point out, if you're a head coach that craves that kind of power, and I always talk about it's more about the job description than the actual title, you can't be the chief of personnel and a head coach of an NFL team because you spend your entire season preparing for the next game. You don't have the time. There's not enough time in the day. So the only difference between having a conventional GM head coach setup versus having the head coach having the power is the head coach has to hire somebody he trusts to give that power. So, and that's essentially Nick's job, and it has been. And he's very well regarded, as I said, in the league. And that's probably where the speculation started, is the fact that, if you don't have that GM title, you probably don't get the credit you deserve because the guy on top of the flow chart gets the credit. That's how it always works. They also get the blame, though. So
real quick,
what you sign up for.
Real quick, John. Jameis Winston got LASIK surgery. Will that help anybody see him as a better quarterback?
Well, I don't know. In so many ways, his season was so impressive statistically last year. Just the yardage, the touchdowns, the 30-30. It's not an ESPN show. It's all. It takes Aaron Rodgers, 6 years to throw 30 interceptions in the modern NFL. It's tough to do that. So I think there's people hoping that maybe LASIK eye surgery will cure the interception problem. But if you're throwing it away that much, it's more than LASIK eye surgery. I assume he had contacts in.
That's possible. I know I can't see, so I feel for him. Football at 4, Johnny Mack, and of course we do it again tomorrow, 4 o'clock, right here on the Sports Bash. Thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, guys.